Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alicia. So today we're going to be talking about my September wrap-up, and I'm really excited because I had a pretty good September month with the exception of a few books, but wow, yeah, I read some amazing books in September, so I'm really excited to go ahead and talk to you about them. I also think we have a good variety. I didn't really stick to any one particular genre. I have speculative fiction, non-fiction, short story collections. Yeah, so I'm just really excited. So without any further ado, let's get right into the video. So why don't we just go ahead and talk about the books in the order that I read them. So the first book that I ended up finishing in the month of September was actually a short story collection. This is called Sabrina&Corina by Kali Farhado Anstein. So this is a short story collection that really centers the Latina indigenous community in Colorado. A lot of these short stories themes focus on sisterhood, addiction, on being unseen, navigating binaries, desire. And what I really enjoyed about this collection of short stories is that a lot of them are open-ended, so it really leaves you to contemplate on what the meaning of that short story was. I do have to say for a few of them I did struggle to capture the so what of the story, but I think that was the intention, for you to really think about it and what the stakes are and what the circumstances of these women are. So I just thought it was a beautiful short story collection. However, I do have to say that with the exception of one, they don't really have a happy ending either. So this is definitely a short story collection that is on the heavier side, so I do suggest looking up trigger warnings before going in. But I also think this is a nice short story collection to pick up in the fall when you're in the mood for something slower, for a little bit something that's a little bit more reflective. Do have to say, just like any short story collection out there, you know, some short stories really stood out more than others. I don't think I've ever really read a short story collection where every single one I was like, bam, yes, I love it. Well, I'd have to think about that, but yes, really enjoyed it. I believe I gave it like a 3.5 out of 5 stars, which is a good solid rating for me. So the next book that I ended up finishing was actually from my physical shelves. This year I really wanted to focus on reading books from my shelves, although that's kind of been a problem with Libby because I've suddenly become such a big fan of audiobooks that I tend to not pick up books on my shelves, but I still try to read at least 2 or 3 just to make sure that I am getting through them. But really excited about this one. So the next book that I ended up finishing was Authority by Jeff Vandermeer, and I guess I might as well mention it because the one I finished after this was Acceptance, also by Jeff Vandermeer. These are the last 2 books in the Southern Reach trilogy. Annihilation is the first book to the series. If you haven't heard me talk about that book enough, I just, had to like mention it in this video. So I ended up giving Authority 4 stars and I ended up giving Acceptance 5 stars. I think just in general the entire trilogy as a whole is a masterpiece. It's fantastic. If you love speculative fiction, if you like sci-fi with like elements of horror thrown in there, if you love books again that are open-ended and really leave you thinking, if you also love books with great atmosphere, but an atmosphere that's also subtle and eerie, oh my god, you're gonna love these books. They're fantastic. In Authority, we are no longer inside of Area X anymore. We follow one particular character for the majority of this book called Control, and he is the new director. We don't know what happened to the old one, but he's trying to get his house in order and also trying to figure out what is going on with Area X and why they keep sending in expeditions when they keep failing. So yes, this is completely different from Annihilation, but I think this one is also one that rewards readers that really take their time with stories. Like if you struggled with Authority a little bit, I say just push through it and read it at your own time at a slow pace, because the building of tension in this book is just fantastic. One of the scariest scenes I have ever read in my life is in this one, and it came out of nowhere for me. I legit like screamed. It was so good. Okay, so that was Authority. So in Acceptance, we go back to Area X, and what I loved about this one is that viewpoints are expanded. So in Annihilation, you follow the biologist. In Authority, you follow Control. And in Acceptance, the reader really gets to see a multitude of perspectives because we do follow several different timelines and several different people, which I thought was perfect for this final book. I loved the ending. Again, one that is open-ended. Highly, highly, highly recommend. I also feel like this trilogy in general is very representative representative of my reading style and of the books that I love. Okay, so back to Libby. The next book that I ended up finishing is Interior Chinatown, and this is by Charles Yu. I gave this book a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I was very close to giving it 5 stars, and the only reason I didn't is because I did consume this in audiobook format, and I feel like if you're going to pick this up, you should really just pick up the physical book or an e-copy, because it is written as a screenplay, and some of those elements just didn't translate really well into audiobook format. There was times where I got a little bit confused, so that's the only reason I didn't give it 5 stars. And in this one, we're following our main character called Willis Wu, and he is in the film industry. So this entire book is talking about American xenophobia and anti-Asian racism through the lens of like the film industry. And so we have Willis Wu. He's sort of used to playing this generic Asian man, always blending into the background, always minimizing himself and his voice, not making a fuss, not speaking too loudly, not asking for things. So he's just really used to playing this like background role, and he really strives to be Kung Fu Man, and Kung Fu Man is like the epitome of the highest level that you can sort of reach, as it is explained in the book, for like Asian Americans. Not until very recently, at least, they haven't really played a big role in any film. And a lot of times when they want to audition for a big role, it's like, no, you're too Asian. Or if it is an Asian role, it's like, oh well, can you speak with broken English? So it touches on these societal problems in a very creative way. It's also filled with satire and wit, so I found myself laughing constantly, even though there are serious topics that are discussed. And I think one of the things that I love the most about this book is that there's a lot of history that's embedded into the story, American history that as an American I never heard about, and I think it's just super important to hear about and learn about it. So it's one that I highly recommend, especially in the light of recent attacks on the Asian community that I'm sure are still going on. They're just not as prevalent in the news, so highly recommend. So like I said, I just had a really good reading month this month, so a lot of these books are just books that I love. The next book that I ended up finishing was Velvet Was the Night by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is Silvia Moreno Garcia's most recent book. It, like all of her books, it is set in Mexico. This one's set in the 1970s, and it's a neo-noir crime novel. I do have a dedicated review for this book, so I'm going to go ahead and link the video in the cards if you do want to see a more in-depth review. So the next book that I ended up finishing is another one that is on my physical to be read pile, or in my physical books, and this is The Inheritance of Orquidea Divina. This is by Zoraida Cordova, and I gave this 5 stars, y'all. Like, I absolutely loved this book. I loved the magical realism in it. I loved the story. I loved the characters. I loved the writing. There was nothing that I didn't love about this book. It's just fantastic. One thing I do have to say is I do have the Book of the Month edition, which I personally prefer. I saw the original cover in stores, and it has a glossy type of cover, which I personally don't like. I think glossy covers are cool, and they have their audience, but they're just not for me. So I really much preferred this one. I'm actually thinking of like spray painting the sides so that they're like black, or like this like hot pink, or a combination of both, or even blue, because there are like little blue hummingbirds here. Anyways, that's completely separate. I'm sure that if you watch other booktubers, you've already heard about this book because everybody seems to be talking about it. So good. I loved it. It was just so beautiful. The emphasis, man, these birds, I'm so sorry, I hope you can't hear that. I just really love the emphasis on family, and it was just very beautiful. It was so good. The next book on this list is Finding Latinx in Search of Voices, Redefining Latino Identity. This is by Paola Ramos. This is another book that I listened through Libby on audio as an audiobook, and this is a non-fiction book. Now, I know that there is a lot of discussion and debate within the Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, Latina community about what terminology we should use, and what terminology is inclusive, etc. And I think this book really delves into the roots of Latinx and the people that identify as Latinx. If you're on here and you personally identify as Hispanic or Latino or Latina or Latina, or think that Latinx is not inclusive or that it's offensive, I highly recommend you to just listen to this book and hear the different narratives and perspective that other people have. I'm not asking you to identify as Latinx. I think we should all identify however we want to identify. That's something that should never ever be forced upon anybody, but I just want to encourage you to listen to other perspectives. In this book, Paola Ramos interviews people in border towns who are immigrants and the struggles that they go through. She also interviews people who identify as LGBTQ+ or who are trans, and you really get to hear their stories and you really get to see their perspective. I realize that I, myself as a Latina, have a lot of blind spots, and I think it's always good to analyze those blind spots and to really get a multitude of stories and perspectives. So one that I think that if you want to learn more about the identification of Latinos, Latinas, Latina, Hispanic, Latinx people, it's one that I recommend you pick up if you're interested in that subject. Second to last book that I finished this month was Tentacle by Rita Indiana, and this is a science fiction post-apocalyptic book. And okay, I struggled with this one because it's really experimental. I think that Rita Indiana has a beautiful mind, and I think if you like these kinds of books, this is a masterpiece. And I honestly thought that I was going to give it 5 stars, so it might be one of my biggest disappointments of the year because I only gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. So the premise of this book is that it takes place in Santo Domingo, so this is in the Dominican Republic, and there has been some sort of climate disaster. It really focuses on climate change, on climate, on history, queerness, legacies of empires. It touches on so many different things, and I think the book itself is inventive and imaginative. So the thing that I struggled with is that a couple of months ago I just read a lot of heavy books, and for the most part I enjoy heavy books. Like I am not one to shy away from heaviness, but this one just had a lot of explicit violence, specifically sexual violence, that I just really felt uncomfortable reading. It wasn't palatable for me. I don't think that the author's intentions behind the explicit depictions of all these scenes is to be gratuitous. The reason that I think she does it is from, again, an analytical perspective, trying to question it. There's also this sort of overall sinister tone that the book has. So in combination with the explicit violence, it wasn't something that I could stomach at the time. So the last and final book that I ended up reading for the month of September is a YA fantasy, and this is Lobizona. It is the first book in the Wolves of No World series. I don't know if this is going to be a duology or a trilogy, but this is by Romina Garber, and this is one that pleasantly surprised me. So I'm slowly reading more and more YA fantasy. I'm definitely not well versed in it. I don't read a lot of YA fantasy. Some YA fantasy reads a little bit too young for my personal taste, but I found this one to be really surprising. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and in this one we follow MateoNY and her mother, and they are immigrants in the United States. They are running away from her father's family, who at the beginning of the book we learn might be tied to some crime in Argentina. And so Manu and her mom escape that, and they're in the United States and they're hiding. Manu has these strange eyes, and her mom doesn't let her go out at night because they glow in the dark, and she really just doesn't let Manu do anything. So Manu grows up feeling invisible, feeling not heard, and not really like herself. So one day ICE raids their apartment and her mom is taken, and Manu starts to investigate her past. She ends up in this camp where there's wolves and there's witches and there's magic, and she learns that her father might belong to that world, and so she takes it upon herself to start to investigate that world and to find out why her mom was hiding her in the first place. I just really liked it. There is a little bit of romance in there, but it's not really the focus of the book. So if you're someone that does like YA fantasy for the romance, I don't think that this is going to be one that's for you, just because it doesn't really have a lot of it. It's definitely not an angsty YA fantasy, so just keep that in mind. So those were all of the books that I ended up reading in the month of September. So if you've made it this far, why don't you leave an emoji down below of leaves, since we are going into fall. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!